Okay, we're back with part two, and we're going to get to the next section of people. I call them like the House of God or the clergy. That's just Friar Lawrence and Friar John. We haven't been introduced to them yet, but Friar Lawrence ends up being the mentor figure to Romeo. He helps him marry Juliet, and later helps them kind of come up with all of their plans to stay together. He ends up being very important. We'll talk about him more in a second. Friar John is a very small kind of side character. He works with Friar Lawrence during some of those plans later on that I talked about, helping Friar Lawrence, Romeo, and Juliet send messages to each other. He's not very good at his job. Okay, so lastly, I want to talk about how these different groups fit together. Obviously, there's the families that we've talked about. That's how I organize them above. There's also the feud, which we'll get into. That's how people relate to each other over this like grudge that the families have against one another. There's the love triangle, so which characters like each other. Some foils, which I'll define in the slides tomorrow. And then lastly, like who is to blame for Romeo and Juliet dying? And we'll break that down. So firstly, there's the families. This is what was above, and this is just like an easier way to look at it. There's the Montagues on the left, the House of Verona in the middle. That's the ruling family, and then the Capulets on the right. Next, we have the feud. Everybody shuffles around a little bit here. On the left is the Montagues, and the right is the Capulets, and they hate each other. In the middle is everyone that kind of sides with the prince and just wants peace and wants everyone to get along. So on the left, the Montagues, Lady Montague, Mr. and Mrs. Montague, and Mercutio are all like pro fighting. On the right, the Capulets, Mr. Capulet, Mrs. Capulet, Paris, because he's close with Capulet, Tybalt, and the nurse are also all like pro fighting. They don't like the people on the other side. And in the middle, we do have some members of like all three households, but they're all the people that want everyone to get along and stop fighting. That's the prince, Romeo and Juliet, obviously because they like each other. Benvolio, who's Romeo's cousin, and then Friar Lawrence, who it kind of makes sense. He's like a priest, and so he wants everyone to be peaceful and nice to each other. Next, I do want to break down some of the kind of the love triangles here that are going on. So Romeo, at the beginning, supposedly loves Rosalind. Problem is, no one thinks this is a good idea. No one takes this seriously because they've never actually met or talked to each other, and only Romeo thinks this is a possibility because he's an idiot. On the other hand, Paris and Juliet are kind of a couple. The only people, though, that think this is a good idea are Paris, Capulet, and Lady Capulet. So, in other words, Paris and Juliet's parents. It is, however, a pretty serious relationship because they're already trying to like set a date for the wedding. And the only reason this is really possible is because Capulet wants Paris to be basically his son-in-law. On the other hand, then we get to the main relationship for this play, and that is the one that most of our main characters think is a good idea, right? I mean, Juliet think it's good. Friar Lawrence is supporting it because he thinks that this is a way that he can bring about peace for everybody. He can help both families start to get along. The nurse obviously supports everything Juliet does. Teenagers everywhere support this idea. Basically, anyone who thinks that you can fall in love basically instantly likes Romeo and Juliet. How serious is the relationship? Apparently, a little too serious, right? They kind of rush into it. They get married like 24 hours after they meet. Sorry, spoiler. That's all in Act 2. And then why is this a possibility? Why is it that it seems like they're able to just start this relationship? That's kind of the question of the whole play. How did they get away with this? How did two 14-year-olds not only get married, but as has also already been spoiled for us, how did they also like end up dying? And how did this whole thing get blown way out of proportion and get out of control? And that's why we're here. We're going to skip foils for now and come back to it. So the final spoiler, like we talked about, is that Romeo and Juliet die at the end. And what we want to know is who is to blame for that? Whose fault is it? And we have several possibilities here. We could say that we want to blame Lord and Lady Capulet, and that's because they keep the feud going and they're trying to control Juliet too much. On the other hand, we could blame the Montagues for not really being present in Romeo's life. Alternatively, we could just blame Romeo, right, for rushing into all of his relationships and being overdramatic. We could just simply blame Juliet for not telling Romeo to slow down or leave him alone. She also makes some mistakes later on that I don't want to spoil yet. There's a few other possibilities I'll get to in the third and final video, so just bear with me. Switch to that one real quick.